My 1/6 scale B-17 first flew in 1995, in a temporary silver scheme. It flew at the Elvington Air Spectacular in August. That was my last show of the '95 flying season. The aircraft was painted in its proper color scheme over the winter, for the 1996 season. It made its first appearance in the new scheme, at the Longhorsley Model Show in late May. During the first takeoff, it quickly became apparent that the matte olive drab paint added a lot more drag than the previous silver finish. There was a strong headwind and also a strong downdraft rolling off the trees, upwind of the runway. The ground level was also rising towards the upwind end of the runway. This made the climb out challenging. The B-17 was flown at Cosford, but had a vibration problem at the Duxford show, so didn't fly. At the Elvington show, there was a fairly strong wind, coming slightly from the crowd line. The same as the Longhorsley show, acceleration was slow, so I kept the model low, building up speed before the turn. I was at the side of the runway, taking off past myself. The B-17 was airborne after about 250 feet and climbing slowly. My co-pilot, operating the outer engines, flaps and landing gear, selected gear up. Just before the first turn, both outer engines briefly went failsafe, and then returned to climb power. I made it through 90 degrees of the first turn, when both radios went failsafe and stayed there. The engines all went too idle, and the aircraft dived into the ground. The following pictures were taken as soon as we reached the crash site, before starting to collect all the parts. The first thing that struck me was how scale-like the crash looked. The second thing I noticed was how minimal the damage was. Now, it doesn't look like it from the pictures, but I'll discuss this in a minute. So let's look at what happened. Here's a Google view of the airfield. The crowd line was about halfway across the grass at the bottom of the image. The yellow line is a 1,000 feet mark for scale. In 1996, 2.4 GHz radios didn't exist, and everything on the UK show circuit was 35 MHz. The B-17 began its takeoff roll from the unfit for use cross, and as previously stated, was airborne after about 250 feet. As the aircraft was climbing away, the landing gear was selected up. This is probably the point where the outer engines went momentarily failsafe. Stall holders opposite to this point in the climb heard the engines cut briefly. The landing gear were operated by electric motors, like the full-sized B-17. On the model, the motor was at the top of the lifting strut, shown in red on the diagram. The geared motor drove a screwed rod which shortened this upper linkage. As the linkage shortened, it pulled up the drag strut which in turn pulled up the main leg, via a short linking strut. The further up the gear traveled, the more load there was on the motor and gearbox. The retract motors were fitted with suppression capacitors. The B-17's radio gear was installed in the bomb bay, with the aerials extending out of the original radio room. Both aerials extended down from the radio room and out across the wings, shown in yellow. As the aircraft made its first turn, it still wasn't that high, possibly 40 to 60 feet in altitude and around 750 feet away. That wasn't the best position for good radio reception. By the time the aircraft completed 90 degrees of the turn, the receiver aerials were now almost in line with the transmitter aerials, receiving their weakest signal. The landing gear was still retracting, and due to the load as the gear was retracting further, the motors were probably creating the most electronic noise. I think the combination of low altitude, aerials lining up and electronic noise, all combined to push the radio gear into failsafe. The rest of the model team were quite despondent at the sight of the wreckage, but they could only see a smashed plane, and not how much of the aircraft wasn't damaged. I'll explain further. The whole of the rear fuselage and tailplane survived intact, bar a couple of stress cracks towards the front. It broke away from the front fuselage at the transport joint, saving it from damage. The tail turret also detached, once again at its transport joint, so there were virtually no repairs to make. Most of the sheeting on the front fuselage was destroyed in the impact, however, the whole of the top decking popped off in one piece. All of the front fuselage formers survived, from the cockpit backwards and could be reused. The chin turret was solid balsa, and while split into about 3 parts, all would glue back together easily. Moving on to the wings, the outer wing panels were also undamaged, coming off at their transport joints. They slotted onto plywood spars, extending out of the inner wing panels. These joining spars had snapped with the whiplash of the impact, saving damage elsewhere. The inner wing panels also survived, mostly intact. The spars joining the wings to the fuselage were undamaged. The area outlined in yellow was damaged. 3 of the engine nacelles, all except the port outer, were smashed from the wing. The leading edge sheeting and the front of some of the ribs were also damaged, but the damage stopped at the front main spar. The main section of each wing was undamaged. That so much survived, I put down to a strong design of each airframe component, and the multiple transport joints which gave way, absorbing some of the impact force. The rebuild started almost straight away, working on the front fuselage. The formers from the front spar to the back of the radio room were all reused. New front formers were cut, and new stringers and longerons were added. The top decking was grafted back on, and new sheeting spliced in. Looking at the other side, in this slightly blurred image, you can see more of the original sheeting was used, along with the plywood root rib for the wing fairing. There were lots of stringers on the underside of the nose, helping to support around 20 pounds of lead, to get the center of gravity in the correct location. There were a bank of power switches for the radio gear, mounted inside the original crew entry door. By the time of the Long Horsley show, in May 1997, the B-17 was looking more like an aeroplane again. The front fuselage was back together, other than the cockpit, and the stress cracks in the rear fuselage had been repaired, but I hadn't started on the wings. For the damaged engine nacelles, I added new plywood doublers, glued onto the sides of the originals, and then fitted new stringers on the outside. The inner nacelle had some new landing gear mount castings made, to replace the original welded aluminium angle mounts. To help overcome the additional drag problem caused by the matte paint, I replaced the 2 inner 3W40cc engines with a pair of 3W60s. The 40cc engine had 3.7 horsepower while the 60 had 5.6, giving a substantial power increase. By March 1998, the airframe was back together again, skinned in glasscloth and epoxy, and was being sanded and filled, ready for paint. It didn't take long after these pictures before I started painting. The B-17 was externally complete by May 1998, in time to appear on static display at the spring Elvington show. It made another appearance at Elvington, for the August show, where I was able to get some great B-17, B-24 and B-29 photos. The B-24 was 1/6 scale and belonged to our model team. The B-29 was 1/5 scale, and was brought over from Belgium. Throughout late 1998, and early 1999, internal work on the B-17 continued. By the time of the Radon Wings, Air and Model show in September, the B-17 was ready for taxi trials. It was on static display on Saturday the 4th, during the air show, and that evening, I did a series of taxi trials. These were recorded on video, as part of the paperwork for the permit for test flying. As part of the Civil Aviation Authority, and Large Model Association regulations, models over 20 kilograms, needed inspecting during construction. Once complete, evidence was needed to show the aircraft was ready for flight, the taxi trials. After this, the inspector could apply for the temporary CAA exemption from the Air Navigation Order, to allow test flights to be performed. These also had to be witnessed by an inspector. At least 6 flights and an hour's airtime was required for the full exemption to fly in public. We bought a new house in the autumn of 1999, and were married in the spring of 2000. For most of that year, we were busy working on the house, and new workshop extension. It wasn't until October 2000, that I finally had time to turn my attention back to the B-17. We arranged to meet up with friends, at the former RAF Oakington for the test flight on October the 14th. I was using a different co-pilot for these test flights. I'd set the B-17 up from the start for 2 pilot control. The pilot controlled the inner throttles and flying controls, while the co-pilot had the outer engines, flaps and landing gear. This allowed me to focus on flying, while the co-pilot could operate the other controls and help with steering on the ground like the full-sized B-17. The tail of the B-17 makes it a big weathercock. We did some taxi trials, so he could familiarize himself with the independent outer throttles. Here's a few minutes video of the first test flight that day. It was quite windy and a bit gusty, but at least the wind was pretty much straight down the runway. At the time, the landing gear was fixed down, as I was still working on parts for a pneumatic retract system. I'm now slowly gaining height for a stall test. We did both power on and power off stall tests. Each time, it was slow, gentle and to the left. After landing, I cut the inboard engines to reduce thrust, and peak taxied back on the outer engines. In addition to the video, we took some still images of the flight. For the second flight of the day, John flew his B-24 Liberator with the B-17 for the first time. It was great to see the two big bombers in the air together. John started building the B-24 in 1995, soon after seeing the early stages of the B-17. It first flew at RAF Culteshall in 1999. Through 2001, I made further validation flights. Here's a picture of my dad with the B-17 at Withensea. By this time, the B-17 had its ball turret made and fitted. During one flight, soon after the banked pass, the port outer engine stopped, and the propeller can be seen being blown around by the airflow. I flew a few more circuits and figure eights on 3 engines, to check out the handling, before coming in to land. The last 2 validation flights were made at Long Horsley, in Northumberland, though these pictures are actually at Cosford. Here I had to fly a number of maneuvers in front of an examiner, to demonstrate my handling of the aircraft, and the aircraft's structural integrity. Once again, it was a very windy day, but thankfully almost straight down the runway. These included fast and slow, low passes. A stall test. Some high G turns in both directions. The last big test for the aircraft was some high G pullouts, putting the B-17 under higher loads than it was ever likely to perform while flying at a display. Finally, the landing, which due to the strong wind, gave the B-17 a very slow ground speed. After these flights, the B-17 was signed off as being fit for display, and my full CAA exemption to fly was issued later in 2001. For the 2002 season, the retracting landing gear were finally operational, and the B-17 was seen, landing gear up, for the first time since 1996. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.